This video will begin a new topic on unit number 9, the Russian Revolution and totalitarians. In this unit, we will start with a look at Russia under the Tsar before moving into the March and October Russian revolutions. Then we will do 3 totalitarianism case studies, with the first one being the conclusion of the Russian Revolution under Stalinist Russia. Our second totalitarian case study will be fascist Italy, and finally we'll be preparing for our unit on World War II as we wrap up this unit by taking a look at Nazi Germany. First, on the topic of Russia under the Tsar. If we'll recall, we've previously spoken about the Romanov dynasty that had ruled Russia for 300 years, culminating with the reign of Nicholas II. The Romanovs ruled Russia as a form of an enlightened despotism. Very similar to an absolute monarchy, the idea that the monarch has nearly all control over the government and that this is for the good of the people. The Tsar knows what is best. Unlike more ancient absolute monarchs, the Tsar does this through a series of bureaucrats, ministers, prime ministers, and those who exercise the functions of government in the name of the Tsar. There also is an assembly, right, like a parliament called the Duma, sort of a Russian parliament. However, the role of the Duma, unlike, say, a parliament in Britain, which had real meaningful power, the Russian Duma, its Congress, its parliament, its role, they did not veto what the Tsar did. They did not make law. Their role was to advise the Tsar. They had permission to say what they wanted in the Duma without fear of being arrested, but then the Tsar could do it or not do it freely. He was the despot, and that was considered for the good of the country. What's Russia like at this time, in the period immediately before World War I? Going into World War I, Russia is mainly an agrarian country, built on a farm economy, with the mere beginnings of industrialization compared to other countries like Belgium, Germany, Britain, the United States, which are well on their way to being industrial powerhouses. Russia is just barely getting started. They're still coming out of a feudal system. Serfdom had only been abolished a couple of generations prior, and this is the condition of Russia. Let's now make a comparison to one topic we've discussed quite a bit before, which is the French Revolution. And we'll look at several similarities between the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. First, in both situations, you had people that were quite desperate. There's a saying that hungry people revolt. Now remember, though, that expectations also play a powerful role. The sad thing is today, there are many people in the world today who are very hungry, and they do not revolt because having a handful of rice a day may be a normal experience for people in the world, so they do not revolt. So remember, our expectations are very powerful. So most people, however, do expect to eat and to be able to make a living. And so when those things are tampered with, people get desperate. People are likely to revolt. That gap between what people expect and what they have, their actual conditions, that can drive people to revolt. Both France and Russia had an extremely powerful monarch. However, let's look at a few key differences. In the French Revolution, France was among the most advanced and developed and economically powerful countries of its day. And it shocked the world that a revolution would topple the government of France. Versus Russia was not at all one of the more advanced countries of the day, and as we just said, was one of the more of the European countries, was one of the more agrarian and least industrialized countries. Another difference is the crisis facing Russia was much greater. France had a financial crisis. France had a limited bread crisis to mainly Paris and other areas. But the World War I posed a tremendous threat to Russia, and the suffering imposed by that war onto Russia cannot be understated. We'll turn back to a topic we touched on in the French Revolution, which is historian Crane Brinton wrote a book called Anatomy of a Revolution. And in this idea, he speaks of 4 stages of a revolution in comparing several revolutions. For our purposes, he talks about both the French and the Russian Revolution. And these 4 stages are that you have an old regime, the old form of government that's to be toppled. And the second stage is that in come the moderate, enlightened, idealistic, optimistic, democratic revolutionaries. However, they often fail, giving way to violent, more radical, or often regicidal revolutionaries. However, these folks tend to provoke outrage among a quieter majority of the people, and then you have a Thermidorian reaction. That term getting its name from the month of Thermidor, which is one of those kooky new French months they created to de-Christianize their calendar during the Revolution, and it just so happened that the rejection of the French terror and the rejection of the radicals in the French Revolution happened in Thermidor, and so we keep that term, and that a reaction such as this in the midst of revolution is called a Thermidorian reaction as a result. Let's go ahead and apply this to our case studies. So, stage 1 of Crane Brinton, the old regime. The definition is, before the revolution, you have tradition, you have authoritarian government. In the French Revolution, this was the Bourbons and the absolute monarchy. In the Russian Revolution, this is the autocracy, the enlightened despotism, if you will, of the Romanov family. The first stage of actual revolution were the moderate democratic revolutionaries. This is the start of the revolution, where there's idealism, enlightenment, democracy. The bourgeois are the leaders of this. In the French Revolution, this was the National Assembly, and similarly, it was the Russian Assembly, the Duma, that were the leaders of this moderate democratic revolution. However, when they failed to solve the problems of the day, revolution turned violent. This is often led by the urban poor. Unfortunately, the new government, despite having a democratic, enlightened system, does not solve problems and does not solve them quick enough, and is often weakened. And they're beset by too many challenges all at once. In the French Revolution, this radicalism was called the Terror and was inspired and driven by the sans-culottes, the urban poor. And in Russia, this would be the Russian Civil War between those in favor of Russian communism, the Bolsheviks, and basically everyone else who ganged up against the Bolsheviks to prevent them from seizing control. You then had, after that, the Thermidorian reaction. The majority of the people grow tired of the violence and the regicide, the king killing that has gone on by the radicals, and you have a more authoritarian government that seems to, in some ways, hearken back to the old regime. That, a revolution means to turn completely around. And ideally, many revolutionaries seek a 180-degree turn. You want to flip everything on its head. Often, like in the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, affairs turn closer to 360 degrees, where you end up with a ruler like Napoleon, who, in some respects, is completely different, but also has a lot in common with the Louis, the Bourbons. And then you had Stalin, an authoritarian ruler that has many differences, but many similarities to Nicholas and the Romanovs and the autocracy that they, in theory, were trying to get rid of. Let's now speak about some of the crises that happen that drive Russia to its desperate situation under Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov czars. First, you had that disastrous war against Japan, where for ethnic, racial reasons, the European-based white Russian people were easily expected to defeat the Asian Japanese. And in fact, that did not happen at all. So when you add in the racial factor and the fact that the Russians had a lot of pride in their military, this was a disastrous defeat. Almost nothing went well. And in the midst of the suffering of this war, there was a petition by people in the capital of Petersburg to petition the Tsar to hear their grievances and to grant the people additional rights and a Duma and this sort of thing. The Tsar wasn't even in the palace when these marchers came to his palace, but guards panicked. They feared maybe it was a French Revolution scenario. Perhaps it was a storming of the Bastille, where rather unarmed people tore the king's guards to pieces. And so someone in the crowd fires, more fire, and several people are killed on the so-called Bloody Sunday. This makes Nicholas look bad, feel bad, and he grants a Duma to the people in response to this event. And then they end the war, they surrender. It is humiliating, but it mostly puts a temporary Band-Aid on any strong revolutionary movement in Russia. World War I is the straw that breaks the camel's back. Between the Ottomans closing the Bosporus Strait, between the Germans closing the Baltic, and the Russians relying on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was almost complete, they are struggling to supply their troops in the midst of this modern industrial war. Russia itself is not industrialized. They're heavily blockaded. They're facing multiple enemies on multiple fronts. They're suffering tremendous casualties. And it starts with men being killed and wounded, but it starts with poor equipment leading to units and divisions being shattered when they come into contact with the better equipped German troops. This leads to broad-scale surrender, more suffering, and the number of young men being lost is in the millions. Millions of young men and millions of miles of territory, square miles, or I should say thousands of miles of square territory, and so you have a disastrous situation. You also had some problems in government. You know, monarchy can be great if you have a great king. And Tsar Nicholas was middling at best in some regards. So you had the Tsar who exercised all government authority on paper. And you can, it's sometimes been spelled Tsar with a T or Tsar. Remember, it's got his root from Julius Caesar, just like the German Kaiser did. We are hearkening back to the ancient Roman Empire. But a couple of other household people, just as the Archduke was the heir in Austria, the Tsarevich is the son of the Tsar, the Tsarina is the Tsar's wife, and the Tsar and the Tsarina had 5 children, 4 daughters, and finally a son who had a rare blood disease, hemophilia. And so when he would bleed from any cut or bruise or a little bump, he could bleed to death. This was terrible news, and they had very little treatment for it. Almost nothing could be done. And so they tried to protect him as best they could, but this was a terrible secret that they did not want people to know about. Remember, this is an age of many assassins, and they do not want people to know that the Tsarevich could die of a nosebleed or a rough bump on the arm. And so they kept this. There was also in the household kept this alleged holy man named Rasputin, who claimed to have healing powers over the Tsarevich, the son of the Tsar. And the Tsarina very much believed in him and convinced the Tsar even to believe in him. However, this caused terrible scandal because what the public knew, they did not know about the disease of the Tsarevich, the son. They knew that this weirdo was living in the royal household, and so rumors that the Tsarina and Rasputin were having an affair were destroying the Tsar's credibility and reputation. Next, the Tsar, the war was going so badly that the Tsar himself left the government to the Tsarina, his wife, and he went to the front to lead the troops. And we'll pick up next time as we talk about how the military will actually begin to break down and will lead directly to the Russian Revolution. Thanks for watching.